Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 25th of April of 2024. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. According to information we have, the Russians have already established complete control over the town by the name of Ocheretina. Today we got additional batch of the videos from inside of the stronghold. On this video we can see a few more Russian soldiers raise their flag in the central part, so we can make a conclusion that Ukrainians abandoned the town already, probably yesterday in the evening, or maybe let's say during the day. Furthermore, we got additional videos from the southern part of the stronghold. On this video, for example, we can see Russian personnel carrier, or maybe let's say fighting vehicle, who was moving from the southeastern part of the stronghold to the northwestern part. As you can see, the Ukraine shows no resistance. The Ukrainians are not bombing the territory completely, and the Russians have no problem to cross already the stronghold from one side to another. The Russian BMP was moving in this direction. Furthermore, we got additional updates from different mappers, including pro-Ukrainian, and according to them, they colored this area as a gray zone because most likely the Russians decided not to, let's say, stay inside of Ocheretina, not to focus on the clearing operation. The Russians decided to move further to the west, and as a result of those attacks, as a result of those attempts, the Russians most likely established control over, let's say, this tree lines along the railways, and most likely the Russians establish control over the tree lines that goes further in direction of Novoalexandrovka. Once again, the reason why the Ukrainians were completely defeated and lost such an important foothold was not misunderstanding and, let's say, miscommunications between the soldiers on the ground of 115th Brigade and their commanders. So this is the situation in the area. Once again, very likely during the next few days the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation will provide us complete information, additional information of complete control over the village. And now let's move further to the south in direction of Novobakhmutovka and Soloviove. As you can see, we have adjusted the map. Also, most of the mappers have updated their maps as well, showing that Novobakhmutovka is under complete Russian control and Soloviove is under, let's say, 20% control of Russian forces. When talking about Novobakhmutovka, we have additional videos of Russian inside of the area. We see 5 Russian soldiers who were raising the flag in central part. This icon was added softly. It's very difficult to geolocate this building, but the most important thing that I would like to point your attention to these 3 soldiers. As you can see, they have some icons on their armor, and if you take a look closer to these icons, you can recognize the icon of Wagner forces. So basically, this area, Ocheretina, Novobakhmutovka, Soloviove, Novokalinovo, Ceramic, was under very heavy pressure from former, let's say, Wagner forces, and probably that was the reason why the Russians were so successful, because once again they sent the most experienced, the most powerful soldiers on this direction, and this is the reason why they managed to break through defense belt of unexperienced and just recently, let's say, not even formed, but that brigade that haven't been involved in any clashes, in any active defense in the previous phases of 115th Brigade. So Wagner's break this defense belt, and we see almost no resistance from the Ukrainian side. But once again, the Russians decided not to stop in, let's say, Novobakhmutovka. They decided to move further to the west, and as you can see, we have significant number of icons in Soloviove as well. According to information we have, at least from the Russian, let's say, military expert Ryber, the Russians established complete control over the area. They captured this territory without almost without any resistance from the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians were forced to, let's say, abandon the village and moved further to the west in direction of the town of the village by the name of Sokol. Currently, the Ukrainians are trying to create another defense belt, the next defense belt along this line, and most likely the Ukrainians will not be able to do this, because if the situation develops this way, most likely the Russians will continue pressure to the west. And let's say continue with Soloviove. We have few videos from the Russian side. On this, let's say, video, we can see the beginning of Russian offensive. That was some kind of artillery preparation, and later we got, let's say, reports, the first video confirming the first video that was published by the Ukrainians. The video was geolocated. We will not watch the video due to significant number of casualties and so on from either from the Russian and Ukrainian side. And on this video we can see some episode that Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians who were storming this building. So we have real evidences, real geolocations confirming the Russian presence inside of the village. We don't have the geolocations from the western part, but at least we have from the eastern. But once again, Most likely that the entire village has already fallen and the Russians established complete control over these territories. Furthermore, we got more details and more updates from Berdichi itself. Today, the sources confirmed that the Russians also, Ukrainian sources, very reliable Ukrainian sources, reported that Berdichi and Semyonovka are completely under Russian control. Novokalinovo and Keramik are in a difficult situation, and a retreat to the conditional line Sokol-Novopokrovsk-Umanska is likely. So, what is happening here? We have also two geolocations which we will not watch as well, because due to significant losses and casualties and so on, the Ukrainian FPV drones and Ukrainian artilleries were bombing the Russian forces along the Kazbierova Street, which confirms the Russian presence there. Most likely the Ukrainians still control this part of Berdichi, but also very likely that they will be forced to fall back also in the western direction towards the towns like Novoselovka-Persha or village Novopokrovska. So the Ukrainians continue their retreating. They can't stabilize the situation, and I'm not even sure what the Ukrainians are going to do next. Of course, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians conducted few interesting operations with the purpose to stabilize the situation, and we will discuss them during the video. Now let's move further. Let's say a few updates about Avdiivka and Russia. The Russians continue, let's say, capturing additional trophies in Avdiivka direction. Few more engineering machines, American M88A2 Hercules, were captured by the Russians and most likely were sent to Moscow, to the let's say Poklonная Square, let's say to show Russians and to show citizens of Moscow all, let's say, every single captured Western weapon before the let's say Victory Day. Furthermore, we have a few more Abrams based tanks captured by the Russians and sent also to Moscow. So as we can see, the situation develops in this way. Now let's move to Krasnogorovka, the second point of pressure, the second very difficult place of Ukraine for Ukrainians, and we see that a significant number of geolocations, significant number of icons. If we summarize everything before we start, we can say that Russians have already established control over more than 50% of the town, and the thing is that the Russians captured the most important buildings, the most important areas, and the Ukrainians control just the residential, let's say, low-rise buildings to the north. The Ukrainians control the useless trenches to the east, which they will be forced to fall back as soon as the Russians bypassed few additional kilometers and so on. Let's talk about the icons. We have different mappers confirms different progress from the Russian side. Pro-Russians are saying that the Russians control the southern part, most of the central part. Neutral sources reported that the Russians control just some southern part and just few areas in the central part, and the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians control just the southern and the southeastern part, which is of course not true, because the Russians got significant results during the previous days. We have a few videos, and the first video is the artillery preparation before the beginning of the Russian greatest attack. Know that you can ask, we're talking always, every single video we're talking about possible Russian offensive operation, where the offensive operation is going to start, but based on the geolocations and based on the videos that we received during the previous few days, we can make a conclusion that the Russians have already started their greatest offensive operation, and most likely the primary target and the primary direction for the Russians is Avdiivka and of course Donetsk directions. So on that video we just let's say you saw on the screen, the Russians were bombing the central part, the industrial zone, before the beginning of the Russian greatest offensive. This morning we got the first video from the industrial zone, and on this video we can see the Russians were waving the Russian flag from the window. This is very important video that give us few interesting things. First of all, we see that the Russians are not raising the flag on the building, which confirms that the area, by the time the video was made, the area wasn't still secured by the Russians. So there was like a lot too many risks that to go on the open air, because you might be hit by the Ukrainian FPV drones or by the Ukrainian snipers. And later we got additional video, a very long video, 6 minutes video, 4 minutes video of Russian attack. we see that the Russians were using very interesting tactics, or more precisely, they continue using the tactics of turtle tank. The turtle tank was always in head of the convoy, and the turtle tank was rushing the Ukrainian positions, were breaking through the Ukrainian defense belt. We see the use of significant number of personnel carriers and so on. We see significant number of artillery strikes, and once again, the most important, we see significant number of stormtroopers that the Russians managed to bring to the central part of Krasnogorovka. Then there was landing, let's say, landing process, and most likely after all these attacks, the Russians captured most of the central part. So we see on the video the landing operation. The troopers start, let's say, leaving and abandoning their personnel carriers and start taking control over the first positions in the central part, the most important, the most difficult, and the most, let's say, fortified area. So we see on this video, on this, let's say, episode, a few Russian soldiers already, let's say, abandoned their personnel carriers and starting declaring operation. So once again, the Russians, during this crazy assault, during this crazy rush, captured most of the central part, most of the industrial zone, and of course the Russians will continue further. This video was published during the day. Most likely that attack took place yesterday, and most likely during the upcoming night the Russians will finish the battle for industrial zone, and then the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back. Furthermore, right before I start making the video, we got another update that the Russians also were moving along Geologichная street, along this area, and as a result of that attack, the Russians established control over this part of Krasnogorovka, and approximately this is the current situation in the area. And that was very important attack, because by that attack the Russians, let's say, cut the main supply roads, cut the main roads between the eastern fortification area, between high-rise area, eastern fortification area, and let's say main supply and evacuation roads. So if the Russians did establish control over this territory, most likely the Ukrainians, of course, due to the let's say, trying to, let's say, not to be encircled by the Russians, would start the evacuation process maybe even this night, because during the day they didn't have these possibilities, being under very heavy Russian fire, but during upcoming night most likely the Ukrainians will start, let's say, abandoning their positions. There are no chances for the Ukrainians to, let's say, to save Krasnogorovka. The only thing they can do is to win some time, but even additional they can cost the losses of hundreds of Ukrainians, and most likely nobody is ready to die for nothing. Like everybody will try to act like 67th Brigade, like 25th or 115th, that basically abandon their positions without showing any resistance to the Russians. So the battle for Krasnogorovka is about to be finished, and most likely the Russians will be able to establish control over this territory before the Victory Day and before the Orthodox even Easter. Now we're moving further to Novomikhailivka. The Russians took a small operational pause, no progress on the ground, just Ukrainians who were bombing and attacking the Russian forces inside of the stronghold. Very interesting details and updates continue coming from Ugledar. You know that today the Russians published another video of how they bombed and attacked the coal mine with FAPS 500 or maybe FAPS 250. Very heavy explosions. Most likely the Russians damaged some ammo depot, and then there was a secondary detonation in the area. And the most important video we received from the southwestern part of Ugledar. The Russians, as a result of Ulmur strike, and according to information we have, the Russians hit some temporary positions or even command center exactly in the southwestern part. This is very important video that shows us that the Russians are moving focus from farms and let's say some residential area along the Kashlagach river closer and towards Ugledar. If we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of months, we can see that the Russians, and we discussed this in the previous updates, mainly during the previous 3 weeks were focused on the farms, were focused on this intersection of roads and on these, let's say, gardens and some buildings. And now the Russians moved their focus further to Ugledar. So I can't tell you for sure whether the Russians are going to attack to start their offensive tomorrow or maybe even this night, but most likely this offensive is going to start very soon, and most likely even before the Victory Day and the May holidays that will take place in Russia. Now we are moving further to Urozhaina. We have a lot of very interesting updates as well. The Russians, after a very short operational pause, renewed their offensive operation. They were bombing Urozhaina and Staromayorsk heavily with all types of weapons they have. And after artillery preparation, the Russians conducted another ground operation, and they managed to improve their positions, let's say, from the southern part closer to the central part. So on the video, on the very short video you just saw, you've just seen the Russians were moving, let's say, along this street, along this line. They landed infantry in this section of farms, and then personnel carrier moved back to the south, and the Russians start storming and clearing this area. Most likely the Russians managed to achieve additional progress, and now the clashes are taking place in the southern parts of in the southern farms of Rozhaina, which is very important for further progress, because you know that we can talk a lot, make a lot of projections and speculations of battle for Ugledar, Konstantinovka, Novomikhalovka, Krasnogorovka, but we understand that when talking about South Donetsk direction, one of the most important strongholds that is still under Ukrainian control is the town by the name of Velika Novoselovka, including Vremivka. And of course, after the fall of Krasnogorovka, Novomikhalovka, Konstantinovka, sooner or later the Russians will reach the next defense belt of the armed forces of Ukraine. We're talking about Karlovka, Galisinovka, Girnik, Kurachovka, Kurachovo itself. This is a rich network of towns. This is like Kurachovo agglomeration, very difficult area to bypass. So that's why for the Russians it will be much more better and much more easier to bypass this area by attacking in direction of Velika Novoselovka, with the purpose to move further after Velika Novoselovka to the town by the name of Bogatyr, which will allow the Russians to cut the main supply road N15 and basically to force the Ukrainians to start withdrawing process and to force them to fall back from Kurachovo to Selidova and Pokrovsk further to the north. So this probably exactly what the Russians are planning to do, and at least they will try to do this, and then they'll see how the situation is going to be developed. When talking about the Zaporozhye area, we don't have anything important, just the regular activity, FPV drone strikes, and a few more raiders of armed forces of Ukraine. Air defense raiders were destroyed as a result of Russian missile strikes. On this video we can see another Iskander or Tornado strike, and as a result of strike the Ukrainians lost another raider. So the Russians continue clearing of the air defense systems. Now we are moving to a very strange and weird direction, to Kherson area, and this exactly as we discussed a few minutes ago, that I would tell you what the Ukrainians are planning or trying to do to slow down the Russians in Donetsk. The Ukrainians understand that they probably has no chances to stop the Russians in direction of Pokrovsk, because the Russians are moving further, no resistance from the Ukrainian side. So the best solution they created is to start another operation in Krynki and along the Dnipro River. The main purpose and the main goal of the Ukrainians is to force the Russians to send reinforcement and additional reserves back to this area, with the purpose just to reduce the pressure on, let's say, Ukrainian positions on Avdiivka and Donetsk direction. This is not going to be like operation with the purpose to establish control over Crimea. This is going to be just an operation to stretch the Russian reserves, to stretch Russian forces, and to force the Russian commanders to send some necessary reserves on this direction. But anyway, different mappers have already updated their maps showing Krynki, part of the Krynki under Ukraine control. We also have a video of how the Russians, according to the author of this video, were bombing the Ukrainian positions in Krynki. And as you can see, we have a very big activity of the Ukrainian FPV drone operators in the towns by the name of Novokakhovka and Kakhovka itself. I'm not saying anything, but maybe the Ukrainians are planning to start this operation exactly on this direction, not in Krynki, because Krynki is not something suitable for long-term defense, because most of the buildings, most of the constructions there are very weak. It's like one fab and half of kilometer would be reduced to ruins. So that's why for the Ukrainians it's better to capture something with high-rise buildings, with big buildings that they can use as a stable foothold for further defense. So I'm not saying anything, but maybe the Ukrainians do have this crazy plan. Anyway, we need more information to see what is going to be next, and we will follow the situation, of course. Now we're moving back to Chasiv Yar, and we have some updates. As you can see, we received not so many geolocations videos, just few fab arrived in the area. We have few FPV drone hunting videos, but as you can see, there is no such big activity as we used to see even 2-3 weeks ago. So most likely the Russians took a small operational pause. They continue bombing the Ukrainians, but without any attempts to attack the Ukrainians on the ground. But the sources are saying that the Russians have already accumulated and concentrated the shock attack feast for Chasiv Yar. Critical mass was already collected by the Russians, but for some reason this critical mass is waiting for something. Maybe the Russians are waiting complete collapse of Ukrainian defense in Avdiivka, Cheretina direction. Maybe the Russians are waiting for for additional progress in direction of Siversk, or maybe the beginning of Russian offensive in Sumy, Kharkiv, and when the Ukrainians will completely lose any understanding any of the situation, any, let's say, ground below their feet, maybe then the Russians will make a final push to Chasiv Yar and to try to collapse completely the Ukrainian defense belt and to make just a panic, and that's it. Siversk direction, the sources reported that the Russians entered Razdolovka. Right before I start making the video, we got report that the Russians entered and managed to move further, let's say, to the northwestern direction. So Razdolovka, according to the Russians, is also about to fall, maybe 2-3 days, and the Russians will reach the outskirts of Perezhny and Fyodorovka. When talking about Bilogorovka, once again, this stronghold is a very tough nut for the Russians. They still haven't managed to crack it. Now we're moving to South Kupiansk. No updates. Central Kupiansk directions, the Russians continue or started destroying bridges and pontoon bridges once again. And now the most important is Kharkiv direction. A lot of updates, as we discussed in the previous video. The Russians start hunting the engineering equipment because they understand that they're not ready probably to start offensive, but they see that Ukrainians are building fortifications. And to reduce the level, because during the next 2 weeks, let's say by the end of the May holidays, the Ukrainians do have chances to create significant number of trenches. Of course, not like millions of kilometers, but enough to slow down the Russians for another 2-3 days, which is very important and, let's say, not just important, but vital, decisive during this fast operation in Kharkiv direction. So the Russians start destroying all these, let's say, engineering machines. The sources reported that Ukrainians launched the business, government offices, evacuation documents, government offices, papers, everything. Currently, the Ukrainians try to evacuate from Kharkiv to Kyiv and many other towns and so on. So the Ukrainians are getting ready for Russian offensive. And we have the most important update, this video. The author of this video claims that on this footage, on these scenes, we can see the Ukrainian convoy that was heading from Kyiv to Sumy along N07 road. So this is N07 road. This is it. You can see this on the map, N07 that goes from Kyiv to Sumy, and the Ukrainians start sending, because probably they received the, let's say, the final evidence that the Russians are about to start offensive here. So that's where they're transferring endless number of vehicles, infantry. But when talking about this video, we can see just Humvees and maybe Max Pros, something light that is currently can't stop the Russians, and something like this. Maybe the Ukrainians suffer already problems with supplying vehicles, and this is the only thing they can, let's say, afford themselves. So anyway, we need more information to understand. Now we are moving to Kyiv. We have also some updates. The Ukrainian mobilization centers working 24 hours, 7 days a week. They're mobilizing. Most likely the Ukrainians will mobilize up to 150,000 soldiers just for May. Of course, this is not something that the Western countries in Ukraine can use, because they need time to, let's say, prepare them. And most likely, most of these 150,000 soldiers would be sent to line of combat contact without a proper, let's say, preparation. They will be just something without any understanding of the military science. They will know how to probably use AK-47, and that's it. And they would be sent to, let's say, a certain, let's say, meat grinder that the Russians will launch on the border. There's no other option. Russia, we have few updates from Russia as well. Important things that Russia start, let's say, frozening and seizure of Western assets as a response to the actions from the United States of America. The Russians are planning to show significant number of, let's say, captured armored vehicles of the Western production. On this video, we can see Max Pros, we can see Bradleys, we can see Leopard tanks of the latest model T2. A6 and many other types of equipment have already been sent to Russia, and this is going to be very interesting. Probably very interesting reports are coming from Belarus. Today the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, reported that they managed to prevent the special operation from the NATO proxies. And according to the president of Belarus, the NATO forces, NATO proxies were planning to establish control over the town by the name of Kobrin. This is the town, and most likely they were planning to attack this area from the territory of Ukraine, because it's impossible to establish control over Kobrin, over this area, through Poland direction, because in this case this is going to be like involvement the Poland in NATO country of the operation. So most likely they were planning to attack from the territory of Ukraine, and the main purpose of that attack, according to Lukashenko, was to cut the region center Brest from the mainland. So this is a very big town, Brest, like it's not like Kharkiv, of course, but like Sumy or Chernigov, very big town on the border with Poland. And by attacking on Kobrin, the proxy NATO forces were planning to cut this capital of the region, and most likely according to Lukashenko, they were planning to create something like Kobrin People's Republic or Brest People Republic. And after some elections, referendums, they were planning to ask NATO for a help to support these people against, let's say, Belarus and Russia and so on. But as a result of special operation, the Belarusian special forces managed to discover all these plans and to prevent them. And furthermore, the head of Russian KGB reported that the also proxy NATO forces were planning or trying to attack Belarus from Lithuania with some drones, but they also were, let's say, discovered and brought down. We start receiving a lot of updates from European countries, and Baltic states, more precisely Lithuania and Poland, have already promised Ukraine to send, let's say, men back to Ukraine, those who can serve in Ukraine army. And I'm telling that there are around 900,000 people who left Ukraine, and now European countries would start sending them back. This is, of course, a disaster. This is like, I believe that this is a part of genocide and break of the human rights of people who have left Ukraine trying to save their lives. And now European countries will send them back. And obviously this is not the road to, I don't know, happy life and happy life for another 90 years or something like this. Most likely these people wouldn't survive the next year if they would be sent back to Ukraine. Furthermore, we got a very interesting report from Macron. Once again he changed the flag. Now he's saying that we need to build a Europe that can show that it has never been a vassal of the United States of America. A few weeks ago he was saying that America is good and Russia and China are bad. Now he's saying completely different things. So we see that the situation start developing in completely unpredictable and projectionable way, and obviously the next few weeks or even months will be the most interesting and the most active months since the beginning of the special military operation. And before finishing the video, I would like to say that NATO countries intensified their reconnaissance operation above the Black Sea, most likely after Ukraine received some storm shadows from United Kingdom. Obviously, during the next few days, the Ukrainians will try to attack Crimean Bridge and Crimea once again. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.